She wasn't supposed to be out here alone. For 3 straight mornings, all 12 of her goats had walked to the exact same spot on the hillside and simply stopped, shoulder to shoulder, refusing to take another step. They weren't grazing. They weren't spooked, weren't bleeding, weren't scattering the way frightened animals do. They just stood there, perfectly still, staring into a wall of kudzu as though something on the other side of those vines was telling them, unmistakably, to stay back. Determined to find out why, she gripped her machete tighter and hacked through another curtain of tangled vines. One more swing. Then she froze. What she found hidden beyond that wall of green would explain why 50 forgotten acres, sold at auction for just $1, had been hiding something nobody in 3 generations had ever expected to find. As you watch, see if you can figure out what the goats noticed before she did, because the answer changed everything that followed. 3 months earlier, those 50 acres had been the piece of land nobody wanted. For nearly a decade, kudzu had swallowed everything in its path, burying rocky hillsides beneath thick, ropey green vines, erasing old fence lines completely, and concealing sinkholes that made every single step across the property genuinely dangerous. The county had grown tired of maintaining it, tired of chasing unpaid back taxes, tired of fielding complaints from neighboring landowners as the invasive vines crept farther onto their property every single year. When the land finally went to auction, the opening bid wasn't set to attract buyers. It was the county's way of simply making the problem disappear. At $1, the land wasn't being offered as an opportunity. It was being abandoned as a burden, after 2 previous owners had already tried, and failed, to reclaim it. Both had arrived with bulldozers, excavators, every mechanical advantage money could buy, and both had eventually walked away with broken equipment, blown hydraulic lines, cracked undercarriages, and 50 acres that looked almost entirely untouched. Before long, people around town stopped calling it farmland at all. They just called it impossible. Yet one question refused to leave her mind. If the land had truly been worthless, why had someone, decades earlier, clearly invested so much into owning it in the first place, before quietly letting it disappear beneath years of neglect? The old county property records mentioned pastureland going back generations, but nothing in those brittle, water-stained pages explained how an entire working farm could simply vanish beneath a wall of vines. The mystery only made her more determined to find out the truth. Rather than trying to overpower 50 acres of tangled hillside the way the last 2 owners had, she decided to outthink it entirely. 12 goats instead of heavy machinery. The plan was simple enough on paper, but it came with one serious problem. She had exactly 1 week before the borrowed goat trailer had to be returned, and without those animals, her entire plan would collapse before it had even properly begun. She had no way of knowing yet that the real answer she was searching for was waiting in the one single place her goats would flatly refuse to enter. She arrived that first morning with 12 goats, a trailer full of portable electric fencing, water tanks, and a plan that almost everyone in town believed was doomed from the start. No bulldozers, no excavators, no crew waiting to help her haul equipment or clear brush. If this land was ever going to be reclaimed, it would happen one small fence section at a time, with 12 hungry, stubborn goats doing the kind of patient, grinding work that heavy machinery had already proven it couldn't manage. The first week unfolded exactly the way the skeptics expected. Drivers slowed their trucks along the county road just to watch the goats disappear entirely into walls of kudzu taller than a man, while she hauled water tanks up steep, uneven hillsides by hand, dragged fencing sections from one grazing plot to the next, and spent whole afternoons hacking narrow paths with a machete just to physically reach her own animals. Some neighbors laughed openly, convinced they were watching someone waste real time and real money on ground that had already defeated people with far greater resources than she had. Others quietly wished her luck, though even they privately doubted she'd last much longer than the 2 men before her. Then, sometime during the 3rd week, the property began to reveal the first quiet signs of change. Small patches of bare earth appeared where direct sunlight hadn't touched the ground in nearly a decade. Weathered wooden fence posts slowly emerged from beneath the collapsing vines, followed, unexpectedly, by sections of old dry stacked stone wall that nobody had realized were still standing underneath everything. Every single evening, the cleared ground stretched a little farther than it had the evening before. The progress wasn't dramatic enough to make headlines in the county paper, but it was steady, and for the first time in years, the land was finally beginning to give way instead of fighting back. One afternoon, the owner of the borrowed goat trailer arrived to collect it as scheduled. He climbed out of his truck expecting to hitch it up, load the goats, and leave within the hour. Instead, he stood quietly at the fence line for several long minutes, watching the goats work, his eyes drifting slowly across the newly cleared hillside stretching out below him. "I've never seen anyone make this much progress out here," he finally said. "Keep the trailer another month." It was a simple, offhand gesture, but those extra weeks meant everything. Without them, her whole plan would have ended before it ever had the chance to actually succeed. By the 6th week, though, exhaustion had begun steadily replacing whatever optimism she'd started with. The electric fencing still had to be moved every few days, hand over hand, section by section. Water still had to be hauled across rough, uneven ground twice daily. And every approaching afternoon storm threatened to wash out weeks of hard-earned progress in a single hard rain. More than once, she sat alone in the cab of her truck after sunset, engine off, staring at the darkening hillside and genuinely wondering whether the two owners before her had simply recognized failure sooner than she had. Then something happened that neither she nor anyone else in the county could fully explain. One section of the property remained completely untouched. No matter how much fresh kudzu grew back beyond it, the goats walked to the exact same spot every single morning before stopping together, in a tight cluster, at what amounted to an invisible line none of them would cross. She ignored it the first day and dismissed it as pure coincidence the second. But by the third morning, she realized she wasn't watching random animal behavior anymore. She was watching a genuine pattern, and whatever had convinced 12 independent, stubborn goats to stop at the exact same place 3 mornings running was waiting just beyond that wall of vines. At first, she assumed there had to be some simple explanation. A snake might have denayed somewhere beneath the tangled growth. A hidden sinkhole could have opened somewhere just ahead, invisible under the vines. Or maybe the faint scent of some dead animal was drifting through the undergrowth in a way only the goats' noses could actually pick up. Each possibility sounded reasonable enough on its own, so instead of forcing the animals forward against their clear instincts, she decided to investigate the spot herself on foot, alone. She walked the edge of that stubborn clearing carefully, studying the ground for fresh tracks, disturbed soil, anything at all that might explain the behavior. She found nothing unusual. The following morning, the goats returned to the exact same place, stopped at the exact same invisible line, and again refused to move another step. She searched again. Same result. By the third morning, she could no longer write it off as coincidence. Goats are naturally curious animals by nature, genuinely, sometimes recklessly curious. Yet they also know, in some deep instinctive way, when pushing forward simply isn't worth whatever risk they're sensing. In front of them stood a dense, matted wall of tangled kudzu, old dead vines, fallen limbs, and thick undergrowth that had woven itself together into a barrier unlike anything else on the entire 50 acres. They could have physically forced their way through it if they'd wanted to. Goats had done exactly that everywhere else on the property for 6 straight weeks. Instead, every single one of them chose to stop. That was the moment she decided, with real certainty, that the goats were trying to tell her something she simply couldn't see yet herself. She walked back to her truck, reached inside, and wrapped her hand around the worn wooden handle of her machete. As she climbed the hillside toward that stubborn wall of green, she began cutting through the thickest, most tangled section of kudzu on the entire property. The first 2 swings sliced cleanly through fresh, springy vine growth. The third swing struck something solid underneath. It wasn't the sharp scrape of exposed limestone. It wasn't the dull thud of another fallen branch buried in the mess. She carefully pulled the hanging vines aside with her free hand and simply stared at what the blade had just uncovered. For several long seconds, she stood there without moving, staring at the exact spot where the machete had stopped dead. The blade hadn't struck solid rock, the way she'd half expected. It hadn't struck another rotting branch either. It had struck wood, but not the kind of wood that should have been standing upright, deliberately, in the middle of an abandoned, forgotten hillside. Curious now, genuinely curious in a way that pushed the exhaustion of 6 weeks temporarily out of her mind, she reached forward and pulled away another full armful of tangled kudzu. Thick, woody vines slid to the ground in a heap, slowly revealing the weathered trunk of an enormous tree that had been completely hidden beneath decades of unchecked growth. Its bark was rough with genuine age, deeply furrowed, yet the trunk itself stood solid and unmistakably, vibrantly alive. She took another swing with the machete, widening the opening through the wall of green, and almost immediately, a second trunk came into view just beyond the first. At first, she thought nothing of it. Mature trees weren't especially unusual on long-neglected land. But as she kept cutting her way forward, one careful swing at a time, something about the pattern began to feel strangely, unmistakably deliberate. Every few feet, another trunk emerged from beneath the vines. Then another beyond that one, until finally she paused, breathing hard, and looked more carefully across the entire hillside laid out in front of her. That was when she finally noticed the pattern. The trees weren't scattered randomly the way they would have been if nature alone had simply reclaimed abandoned ground over the decades. They stood in straight, evenly spaced rows that stretched far beyond the small opening she'd managed to clear, each trunk positioned with the same careful, deliberate spacing as the one before it. Someone hadn't simply allowed these trees to grow here by accident. Someone had planted every single one of them on purpose by hand. As more sunlight finally filtered down through the newly opened canopy overhead, another detail caught her attention. Hanging quietly beneath the leaves were small pieces of fruit, rough-skinned and irregularly shaped, their colors shifting from deep crimson to patches of pale, almost translucent yellow. They looked nothing at all like the polished, uniform apples stacked in supermarket displays back in town. Yet they weren't spoiled or diseased in any way she could see. They looked, somehow, like fruit from another era entirely, quietly surviving while the rest of the world had simply forgotten they were still out here. She slowly turned in place, taking in row after row of hidden trees stretching across the hillside in every direction. And at that exact moment, the truth finally became impossible to ignore. She wasn't standing inside forgotten woodland. She was standing inside a forgotten orchard. The discovery answered the question that had first brought her to that hillside, but it immediately raised several new ones. Someone had clearly planted these trees with real care and real intention. So who were they? Why had an entire working orchard disappeared so completely from local memory? And if it had genuinely been out here all along, hidden in plain sight, how had nobody in the county ever stumbled across it before now? Knowing she needed answers well beyond her own knowledge, she reached out to an elderly orchard specialist who'd spent over 4 decades identifying old, forgotten fruit trees on abandoned farms across 3 states. People sometimes called men like him apple hunters, because they traveled from property to property specifically searching for heirloom varieties that had quietly disappeared from commercial agriculture generations earlier, varieties most people alive today had never once tasted. When he arrived a few days later, he walked slowly between the rows without saying very much of anything at all. Every so often he stopped to study the bark texture closely, examine individual leaves, or measure the exact distance between trunks before jotting a brief, cryptic note into a small, worn notebook. The longer he explored, the quieter he seemed to become, and his growing silence made her wonder whether he was seeing something out here that she simply couldn't. Eventually, he reached up and picked a single apple from the nearest tree. Without saying a word, he unfolded a worn pocket knife and sliced it neatly in half. Instead of the bright, uniform white flesh found in nearly every modern grocery store apple, Faint pink streaks spread outward from the core toward the skin, dense and richly colored in a way she had genuinely never seen before in her life. He picked another apple from a different tree, then another from the row beyond that, cutting each one open with the exact same careful, deliberate attention. Several minutes passed before he finally lowered the knife, removed his glasses, and slowly looked out across the whole hillside. "I don't think some of these exist anymore," he said quietly. Seeing the confusion plain on her face, he explained. America had once been home to more than 17,000 named apple varieties. Many of them developed over generations to suit specific local soils, specific regional climates, specific small communities that no longer existed the way they once had. As commercial farming gradually became more uniform, more centralized, more focused on a handful of varieties that shipped well and looked good on a shelf, thousands of these older varieties simply disappeared. Most weren't deliberately destroyed, he told her. They were simply abandoned, and eventually quietly forgotten. The kudzu, he explained, hadn't actually killed the orchard at all. By completely swallowing the hillside, it had accidentally hidden the trees from view and, in the process, protected them for decades from logging, from development, from every kind of ordinary human interference that would have otherwise torn them out long ago. Then, almost as suddenly as the mystery of the orchard had solved itself, another mystery solved itself right alongside it. The county hadn't knowingly sold a genuinely priceless heirloom orchard for $1 single. They'd sold 50 acres they honestly believed contained nothing but invasive vines and worthless, rocky ground, because the orchard itself had vanished from public memory long before it ever disappeared beneath the kudzu. No surviving records mentioned it. No maps marked its location. As far as anyone alive still knew, it had simply ceased to exist, right up until 12 stubborn goats stopped walking at the exact same invisible line, 3 mornings running. Over the weeks that followed, more and more of the hillside slowly emerged from beneath its blanket of green. Every new section she cleared revealed another row of fruit trees, another carefully planned piece of an orchard that had survived in complete silence, while the entire world around it simply moved on without it. What had first looked like 50 acres of hopelessly overgrown, worthless land was gradually revealing itself as the life's work of people whose names had long since been forgotten by everyone still living. Standing among those trees one quiet evening, she found herself thinking hard about the family who must have planted them, decades and decades earlier. Someone had dug every single hole by hand. Someone had chosen each individual variety for a reason that made sense to them at the time, imagining these trees feeding not just their own family, but generations of families still to come. Then, somewhere along the way, life had simply changed the way it does. Families moved away. Farms got abandoned. The relentless, patient spread of kudzu slowly erased every visible trace that an orchard had ever existed there at all, until eventually it disappeared so completely that even the county genuinely believed there was nothing left worth remembering. And yet, beneath that thick blanket of vines, the trees themselves never once stopped doing exactly what they'd been planted to do. Season after season, year after forgotten year, they kept growing, kept flowering, kept quietly producing fruit, patiently waiting for someone willing to actually look beyond what covered them instead of judging the whole property by nothing more than its surface. She realized, standing there, that the real difference hadn't simply been the goats themselves. The 2 men before her had tried to conquer this property with bigger machines, genuinely believing the land itself was the actual problem to be defeated. She had approached it instead with patience, letting her animals guide her attention rather than trying to force the landscape to bend to her plan. In the end, the goats hadn't uncovered buried treasure in any traditional sense. They'd uncovered a forgotten story, proof that history isn't always lost simply because it disappears from view. Sometimes it survives in plain sight, hidden beneath years of accumulated neglect, patiently waiting for someone with enough patience to actually notice what everyone else had long since learned to simply walk past. Looking back on it all, she realized the single most important moment hadn't actually been the day she finally uncovered the orchard itself. It had happened 3 quiet mornings earlier, When 12 goats reached that same tangled barrier, stopped together as one, and refused to take another step forward. If they'd simply pushed through the vines the way everyone had expected them to, she might never have noticed that anything unusual lay waiting just beyond them. Instead, they'd quietly, insistently drawn her attention to the one single place everyone else had spent years learning to overlook entirely. For years, people believed those 50 acres were worth exactly $1. Not because the land itself genuinely lacked value, but because nobody left alive still remembered what had been hidden beneath the kudzu the whole time. Sometimes the greatest discoveries don't begin with finding something extraordinary. They begin, quite simply, with refusing to ignore a question everyone else had already decided to dismiss. So here's something worth thinking about. If you'd bought 50 overgrown acres for $1, and your animals flatly refused to enter one small corner of the property, would you have kept searching to find out what the land was actually hiding? Or would you have walked away the same way everyone before you already had? I genuinely love to hear what you would have done. And if you enjoy stories where forgotten places reveal extraordinary pieces of rural American history, be sure to subscribe and join us for our next journey.